so I think we'll make a start. I was trying to decide if I was going to wait till 40, and then if we didn't hit 40, of course, we might be here some time. So I didn't want to waste any more of anybody's time. My name's Richard Brownhill. I'm an improvement manager with the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team. My colleague Nick Holding and I today are going to hold the ring on this particular session. We are here to try and share some thinking, some learning, some perspectives around action learning in particular, and related to some of the work, I guess, of the UEC programme, although this is less about the direct link and more about sharing skills and perspectives in this area. But we're going to give over half an hour to yourselves after we've just gone through some of the material, really just so we can share and understand and learn from each other about what might be useful in terms of application. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. And if something's thoroughly confusing, by all means, put your hand up. But otherwise, we'll try and just sort of steady through the presentation as we go. So thank you very much. Just to begin with, to acknowledge colleagues at the Wessex Academic Health Science Network. If you click on the link here, you'll see some elements that are remarkably similar to some of the slides that we're going to show you. So we'd like to thank Wessex for doing such an amazing presentation. Actually, you can't really improve too much upon that. So we have used quite a lot of the material that's in there around this particular session, but we've also added some other elements. We appreciate that sometimes these sessions can be tricky because looking at esteemed colleagues in the chat, there's an awful lot of experience and expertise. That sometimes means we know lots of things about certain things and maybe not about others. And this is a shared learning space where actually we're all experts of our own thinking and our own lives, and sometimes nothing else. But that's about bringing together our existing experience and learning from it. And surely the point of action learning is to help each other to increase our own learning and perspectives and create some material to be able to move forward with, because often this thing is iterative and emergent rather than it's suddenly something that's a single idea in somebody's head. So thank you for bearing with us. And as I say, we'll draw on some of that as we get into the chat later. Thanks, Nick. We just wanted to contextualize, I suppose, the type of work that we do, really. So whilst in action learning sets, we tend to be focusing on individual thoughts, we work in a socio-technical system. So healthcare is probably one of the most complex systems we can work in. And I just wanted to kind of frame some of the difficulty and the challenges that I'm sure you all face every day. But remember that we might want to relate to some of what we're hearing to our own perspectives, to other people's perspectives, and indeed to the system. So systems thinking is an approach to kind of complex relationships. And what we know is when relationships are highly effective, we tend to function and learn more and gain more confidence and trust in what we do. So systems thinking is about trying to work together, create those relationships, but also recognizing that things aren't linear. So I know we work in a world where we often have strategic perspectives and we have things that we aim to achieve, and that's really, really important to give us focus. But there's also not always a linear relationship between what we do. So when we think about we need to do X or we need to do Y, sometimes we can be overly simplistic in how we think that happens. So part of systems thinking is to remember that there are lots of different things that contribute to outcomes, and what might be somebody's positive outcome, maybe somebody else's challenging outcome. Also might mean that we produce something that's a recognized outcome. So it might be a number or a particular perspective, but it may be that we've had to do an awful lot of work around and correction and introduce other error and risk within that. So this is just part of life, but it's really useful to kind of think about when it feels difficult, that this is why it's difficult. It's not because we're not capable and competent people. Also, very unlikely that a single part of a system will universally change outcomes. So we do have lots of, metrics. We've got lots of good practice. We've got lots of examples of things that people have achieved. But those simple things on their own tend not to work without the commonality, the consistency, the perspective, the culture, driven by a collective of people. So again, just interesting to think about that. But if you want to know a bit more about systems and complex thinking, there are a range of tools that exist that allow us to collect data and perspectives, which include things like co-design. So we understand that we're not just looking at one thing, but we're trying to include those who are using the service, who are working in the service, and who are doing things at different levels. And a couple of references here. So on the left there, we've got Duncan McNabb's work around systems thinking for healthcare quality improvement, which is quite a nice way of looking at how we might go about making a change or an improvement within the context. And a lot of that stuff will be quite familiar to us, but there's some more detail that sits behind that in quite a good article within the BMJ there. And on the right, we've got a SEEPS model, so systems engineering in patient safety. You'll see this increasingly being used in what's called the PSERF framework. So our safety framework that's now within the NHS, but allows you to, rather than looking at a single thing, look at the different domains within which we work. So for example, if we looked at an emergency department, the internal environment is key as to how you can flow through that emergency department. The organisation and the broader way in which you conduct your care is obviously going to have an impact, as is the tools and technology. So they're just lenses and ways of us being able to break things into different component parts, but to understand when you put them back together again, that there's some emergent things that we don't always recognise. Thanks, Nick. Some of you may have heard about the large-scale change model. Some of you may have been undertaken the program, the course that NHS England run. It's a really powerful program, really helpful in terms of, as you can see here, moving the ship or the tanker. So we face complex and challenging situations every day, but we also recognise how much success we've achieved in that. And it's important that we help each other to frame where we're heading, but also what success looks like. And that's really key. And we can make enormous changes through doing that. And the large scale change model is really helpful at giving us a method or a way of thinking through that. And we're just going to spend a minute or two just listening to how that's set up now, because again, it's useful context. Thanks, Nick.
In any large-scale change, there's an initial trigger or spark for action, something around which there's a desire or need for change or an ambition for some new, improved future state. There are many situations that could provide this trigger from within and outside the system, but the important thing about whatever the trigger is that it provides a real sense of urgency to act. Around this sense of urgency and initial idea for change, we can develop a vision from that idea of what we're trying to achieve. It needn't be a very complex vision. In fact, ideally, it should be really simple and perhaps comprise a few meaningful things that people can get their head around and understand what you're aiming for. This vision needs to be articulated in a way that people can understand logically, but also connects with people emotionally. A vision that appeals to both heart as well as head. A compelling vision can be used to attract others who want to play a role in progressing and achieving the vision, to turn the initial idea or ambition into something meaningful. It's important that this initial group of people can adapt and shape the vision, framing and reframing it so it makes sense for them, but without losing the initial concept and aim. This group needs to be the engine room for the change effort and take action to develop the blueprint and details of what this future state is really going to look like for the people who have a stake in it. If people are energized sufficiently by the vision and the proposed future, they will be compelled to act in the work that they control, over the networks and people that they know, or the work that they are involved in, they will act to steer things in the direction that they've been brought into through this vision. There may also be things going on within or across organisations in the wider system or in the local or national policy agenda that align with what you're trying to achieve. If you see these opportunities, it's a good idea to go with this momentum and see what can be co-opted into your change efforts. Through taking action on many different fronts and trying different things to progress towards your vision, something good is going to happen. It could be something really small. It might be that somebody tried something out within their service and hey, it worked. You have to really look out for these things and show that you're trying to do something and that the change has been successful. When you spot those little things, you really need to celebrate it. It's important to tell the wider community that, hey, we've got this vision and some people are trying to make a difference. We've not been doing it for long and here's some evidence that it's working. By telling stories and celebrating loudly, you can attract others to get involved. Maybe they've been watching and wondering if it would last or achieve anything. By celebrating successes, the wider community can see this might be different, and maybe it is worth investing their time and effort into. You're going to go around this cycle many times, framing the vision, telling stories, attracting people, taking action and celebrating success. It might take a long time, years even, so it's important to get started and see where you can get to. As you go around these loops developing momentum, attracting more people and taking action towards their aim, you're going to start to see the evidence of some results. Over time, maybe a long time, one of three things is going to happen. The change will succeed, it will plateau, or it may fail to make the impact that was intended. The literature on large-scale change suggests as many as 70% will fail and only 5% will succeed fully in achieving their aim. But the good news is about a quarter of large-scale changes do get so far, achieve so much success, and then plateau out. They don't achieve everything they wanted to achieve, but they do achieve a lot, and they provide a good platform for more change. However, the more you follow our large-scale change model, the more you can get the vision right at the front end, the more you can get the right people involved at the start, and the more multiples of change you can initiate, then the more you can celebrate about the good things that are going to happen and the greater the chance of your success.
So I'm going to go through a bit more detail now in terms of how all that relates and all the conversation that Richard just had, how it may relate to an action learning set in its structure. One of the one thing I'd say about an action learning set, it is just one way of doing this type of approach. We will all be, as we talk through it, you'll all recognise parts of it. And I think sometimes we can get a bit bogged down by certain brands or certain tools and get fixated on one particular approach. Well, we're going to talk through action learning sets as a mechanism, but I think you'll often recognise other familiarities in terms of other approaches like breakthrough series collaboratives or other programs of work that you probably recognise with a series of learning points coming back together, action periods coming back together again. So, but we're going to talk about action learning sets, but you may choose to interpret these in a slightly different way. The key point about action learning sets is the word learning. This is not about program management or performance management. This is an opportunity to create an environment where people come back and learn and reflect and get a bit of feedback and help them progress in terms of their improvement journey. So we often start with trying to understand what are we trying to achieve here, and I'm just going to reference the work of Amy Edmondson here, who in the book Teaming she wrote, and she talked about how do we organise our work and how do we organise our improvement, and do we organise it to learn or do we organise it just to execute? And what we find is that when we organise to learn, we get better results because it's iterative, it's continuous. Once we've organised the work, then when we move into execution phase, do we execute to learn or do we execute for efficiency? So just to get it done, or do we truly engage in a piece of improvement work to even through the design and the execution that we're continuously learning? And that's where an action learning set comes in. because it really does draw on the element of learning through tests of change and through trial and experimentation. So I did mention before we'll share the slides. So very wordy slides. We don't like wordy slides, do we? So, but I will share these with you afterwards so you can see the details. There's a few points just drawing out the key elements of action learning sets is about how we foster that environment of learning. Then that's done through experiment and through experience, and then we act on that learning. And us as facilitators through those action learning sets, we help draw that out. We're not actually driving or performance or program managing that learning, but we're creating the environment where people who are involved in those learning sets can truly learn from those experimentation and those actions that are taken in their own workplace. So it is very much an experimental based approach to learning, but it's in a structured way, which provides a level of discipline and consistency that the people who are participating in those learning sets know what's expected of them and know what's going to happen through the program of work. Again, another wordy slide, but just drawing out a few key pieces from this. This is more about the how section. I think that's what we're talking about today around action learning sets. We know how we're going to be using it in terms of or who is going to be involved through this program, and we know when over the next months and years. But the how really is about that structure, and we'll touch on this in a bit more detail as we go through it. The structure is about how we create the environment through a set of ground rules to start off with, where each presenter is allowed to present and share their issues, their barriers, their constraints that they're coming up against. And the other participants in that learning set and us through facilitators and through role modelers, we help to demonstrate a sense of listening and learning, and where each presenter then is able to gather that learning and produce a little action plan. And this is not a great 10-page action plan. This is a small action plan that those presenters can go away with and bring back to the group to reflect again and on their progress. So working through the cycle, through the action learning set cycle, it really does start with the individuals working on real issues and real problems that they're experiencing in their work. These are the constraints that they're facing. It relates to understanding clearly where they're heading, so they'll know what they're trying to achieve and what are those barriers that they're facing that needs to be worked through. The presenters, when they bring back the information to the action learning set, these will be the recovery champions, I suspect. They need to be able to describe the problem well enough so the rest of the people in the group can really understand what's happening. That means being quite explicit in that safe, friendly environment that we've created. We then create an environment where once the presenter has shared their constraints and their concerns, there is an environment of questioning to understand a bit better. This helps the presenter understand better, but it helps the rest of us understand as well. These questions should be open-ended, not closed, to engage a level of dialogue, but there should always be with a level of positive intent, not critical, being respectful, and we should be avoiding the risk of giving advice at this stage. We're just asking questions to enable the individual to learn a little bit better and to gain a deeper understanding or to help them to reflect further. All this involves high levels of active listening. So this is not where we would be potentially listening just to find the gap so we can respond, but truly listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And this again helps us all practice those deeper listening skills. That's both from the person presenting, but also from us as the action learning set. If we were in action learning set, we'd be listening to the answers as well to help us to maybe ask a follow-up question. At this point, through the active listening process, we should be keeping an open mind. And this truly is a requirement for everybody involved, whether it's you or us as facilitators, but also the participants who are coming into that action learning set as well. We sometimes can get caught up in the quite low level listening because we've got something to say and we don't actually truly listen. There's a period of reflection and feedback, and this cycle happens through the action learning set for each participant. There's a period of reflection in terms of the person who presented their constraint may want to gain some further clarification on a question, some initial reflections back on what they've heard, making sure they've heard properly, but also helps them to start to frame some of their next step actions, which really does then move into the learning phase, where we move into the next stage doing bit. So from that discussion where the presenter has heard the questions, have responded to questions, they've sought some feedback, they're now looking to develop a very simple action plan which they'll take forward into the next period of doing phase. So, and I'll put a little example of what I mean by an action plan. It is a very simple, 4 or 5 actions that have come out of the discussion, who's going to be doing what and when do they expect that to be done by, and they'll bring that back to the next learning set in the following month. And this the simplicity of this is important, and as facilitators you are not program managing this or performance managing it. This is for the individual to take away and to hold accountability for that work. And many of you will recognise the model for improvement here, and this is very much linked to that. This is why I talked before about there are different methods here, but it all kind of links back to broadly the same thing. As an improvement guy, I hear lots of different models and tools. They all kind of do the same. And again, we're talking about a similar thing here, where we recognise the model for improvement, what we're trying to achieve, how we know that we have achieved that improvement through some measurement, and what are some of those ideas for improvement that we can test out, and then move into that rapid improvement cycle in the testing phase, which would then bring back to what the action learning sets give, I suppose, is an element of a forum, a safe forum which those participants can bring their tests of change back to reflect on and get some feedback in a safe space. I put together a very broad, very loose suggested structure of what you may use through this program, and then what we talked about before in terms of the how. And this really is a very flexible model, but you're always going to start off with a kick-off meeting, some kind of conversation where you'll set those ground rules. You'll be clear about what we're trying to achieve here, and you'll essentially set up the structure of the action learning set. There's then a period of testing those ideas out, and within that there may be some local check-ins as well, where the participants of the action learning set in their own workplace may be having some weekly check-ins, possibly with their own teams, and this, wherever that may be. Timings, no great suggestions around timings, but broadly you're usually kind of working on a monthly program through those learning sets. So in between those monthly learning sets, there's probably something happening within the workplace, and that's what we look to try and encourage, something more localized, which is not all about waiting till the following month to bring everything back. The learning sets are an opportunity for those participants to come and to reflect and touch base with like-minded people. Reference the model for improvement there again through those ideas testing. I think it's important to encourage that through that cycle of trying things out, measurement, knowing how you're doing, not just getting I think it's getting better, or I think it's getting worse, or whatever that be. We need to understand, is it truly getting better or worse? So those periods of learning sets through the structure, going on for as long as you feel they need to through the program of this work, but at some point there is going to be some element of celebrate and sharing and broader learning. You may drop those in every 6 months, you may wait until more towards the end, but it's important to have that opportunity to create a bit more of a focused area around the sharing and the learning. So that's broadly just a very high level suggested structure of what an action learning set program could look like. We talked about ground rules, and these are some of the things that we said from the outset. I'm going to just chuck back to Richard at this stage to wrap things up for us.
Thanks, Nick. I suppose some of you may well have experienced action learning sets either as participants or leaders or facilitators, and we thought we'd just spend a minute or two just talking about some of the hints and tips, some of the, I suppose, core elements. So whilst the word challenge is sometimes used, challenge means different things to different people. But the idea here is to try and challenge each other in our thinking. So this is a learning space. This is somewhere where I might say, I've had a terrible month, I've achieved nothing, nobody wants to listen, and it's an absolute nightmare. Fortunately, not a typical experience, however, for me. What's interesting about that is once we've listened to that particular individual talking that way and speaking that way, we want to know a bit more about why they feel like that. So why do they feel they've achieved nothing? Why do they feel nothing's happening? So what are they using to benchmark or consider that? Is it a feeling or a sense, or is it it's not gone as fast as they wanted to? So the challenge piece isn't about saying, oh, well, you need to try a bit harder. Of course, challenge is about, we need to understand a little bit more about, so it sounded like from what you told me in your couple of minutes there, that you had a meeting with X, you spoke to Y, you've done Z. So there's something here about really encouraging people to learn from the learning, because actually what we want to come out of this is, it might be that what you're not really good at is getting a sense of self-awareness about sometimes how long things take, or is there a different way of tackling? We use this term engagement a lot. So we say, oh, I couldn't get engagement. Well, my question is, what were we trying to do? And what does engagement mean? Does it mean that we didn't use language somebody understood? Is it that we didn't pick our right time? So it's really important that we use that challenge, if you like, to support each other through that learning. And with that comes the responsibility of ensuring that the things that are discussed feel psychologically safe. And we also have that kind of climate of confidentiality and yet openness. So we need to use it as a forum for safe learning. That doesn't mean that there's not some really useful themes that actually, when we listen and we facilitate and we hear what the group has said, that we're all finding it a bit difficult to navigate X or to do Y. That's incredibly powerful, because that then leads into how we collectively might want to focus on that as an action. And indeed, how from a broader program perspective, there may be some really useful feedback loops that allow us to say, how are we tackling this at more of a broader level, whether it's within the local improvement or the national improvement. So it's really useful to get that perspective from those people who are closest to things that are going on. So we do want people to move from that, and ideally to be more explicit. So some of the skill in facilitation comes from, hang on, what's this thing we're actually trying to describe? What is it that we're actually looking at? Because that again allows us to be more focused within our actions. Next slide, Nick, please. Now, you can set your own structure up, provided it's consistent, but what we want to do is establish a consistent structure. So we'd want some form of check-in at the beginning. So check-in would probably be making sure everybody's okay. How are they doing themselves? Keeping it brief, of course. And a reminder of why we're there. So what's the thing we're trying to achieve? What's the thing we're trying to improve? What's the thing we're trying to deliver? And along with that, we might get some updates on how far we got with either our action plan or those things we want to deliver as part of the project, and link that to our aims. Always need space for listening, but then space for questions and discovery and learning after that, which is really, really key. And then feedback really from the wider group. So once I've had my 2 minutes of feeding back what I want to say, the opportunity for others to perhaps feedback on what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. We'll often hear this term that people say, oh, I'm going to be objective for a minute, ... What we know is people can't be objective. It's not possible, because our life experience makes us instantly subjective. What we might want to do is have a shared understanding of what we think is good, or what we think is helpful, or what we think is useful. So that subjectivity, that perspective, that input of people's different perspectives is a really powerful tool to the action learning overall. So that feedback's really key and leads us on to our next steps. So Our role as a facilitator may be to role model helpful questions. So you said this, tell me more about. Part of that role modeling is really difficult for people like me because I have to keep quiet for 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and that's incredibly difficult. But not interrupting somebody, there's real power in that listening and that thinking and that assimilating. We have a tendency sometimes in our busy lives to reload and instantly go back and ask a question, why is that, or what's happening here? But that pause for thought's really, really key, both to role model as the facilitator, but also within the group to really think about what they're seeing, hearing and feeling. And as I mentioned, that needs to be that safe space. We need to move around the action learning cycle. So it's no good just talking about stuff. We need to turn that and convert that into action. So part of the time absolutely needs to be about, so what? So what are we going to do next? And of course, there's a real skill in keeping to time, because we heard at the beginning about the complexity of our health and social care system. This is not going to be easy to fix stuff. So trying to get stuck in the knotty mess of funding, for example, might not lead us to a place where we can actually create some tangible, meaningful actions. So keeping to time and really focusing on the so what within our learning set is really, really important. We also might want to plan dates and time well in advance. We want to have co-design. We want to have representation from different champions, from different groups, from different specialties, professions, etc. We want to be in a position where we're getting a rounded picture of what our life looks like. And the closer we get to a representation of what our system looks like, the more likely we are to be aligned in those relationships and those ability to understand those perspectives. So you can learn more about action learning sets from this reference here. Really useful resource for reading through, but quite an easy thing to find out about. Some of this is about operationalizing this into what you find and what your teams and participants find useful and meaningful. But hopefully we've set out an outline of what we've certainly seen or certainly experienced. And now we're out to a little bit more of a wider discussion. So we'd welcome any comments, questions, thoughts, or otherwise. Thank you.